Today we're going to finish chapter 42. We're coming towards the end of this chapter, a very instructive chapter, a very easy to relate to, not easy to achieve, to relate to when the chapter speaks to us. We left off last week by saying that while it's true that we can't see Hashem physically, Hashem can't be seen, nevertheless, we can't see Hashem, not just with our mind's eye, but even more than that. And we went to explain that, for an example, when you're inspired or you're moved or you're afraid of a king of flesh and blood, it's not the skin and it's not the physical flesh of the king that causes you fear. It's what the king represents. Or in other words, it's the true identity of the king. It's the soul, the power, the force, the authority of the king that really causes you a fear, causes you to be in awe of this great man. And for example, if a king was covered in many layers, and he was covered with many layers of clothes, maybe a winter coat or other layers of clothes, it wouldn't cause you any less fear. You wouldn't say to yourself, I can't really see the king, and therefore I'm not so afraid of him. It's not the flesh of the king, the skin. It's the king that you see by looking at him. By looking at the king and seeing the king, you see his authority. And the proof that it's not the king in his flesh is that the king was in a deep, deep sleep that he wasn't awaking from for a month or a week. You wouldn't be afraid in front of him to act in any way that you saw fit to yourself, in a very relaxed fashion. But if the king was awake, you would stand with a tremendous awe and fear, knowing the tremendous power of the king. So it's not the flesh, the physical part of the king. It's by looking at him, you understand the depth of, and it's not like you understand by looking at him, you start thinking to yourself what that reflects. You see him, you are in fear and in awe of the power that he is, the authority that he is, the strength that he is. And this causes, and this again is only something we can talk about because we don't have in our time today such an authority. The last time the world had such an authority was probably the Tsar, unless you lived in one of these third world countries where you had Iran, you had Saddam Hussein or other powers that you stand in front of the dictator, and there probably was a similar feeling of a king, except that a king is supposed to be a kind, a gentle force, that at the same time you have a tremendous awe for the power. Not necessarily are those the best examples, but the concept is that it's not the king itself that you're afraid of, it's the power that he represents. And the same thing we said about the world, that when one looks into the world, one can see immediately the tremendous awe and power of godliness that fills the world, from the planets, the solar system, a blade of grass, to a little a spider. You see the tremendous greatness of God. One of the things I was thinking about since last class, I'm not sure if it's the best metaphor, but it's a powerful metaphor. And that is the idea of atoms in the world. Every one of us know, or we should know, that everything in the world is made up of molecules that are made up of atoms. And these atoms are constantly moving. Now, while when you look at the physical item, whether it's a plate, whether it's a cup of soda, whether it's an animal, you might not see the atoms. But if you think about it, it will cause you a tremendous awe for the concept that this idea of this glass cup sitting in front of you is billions of atoms. And in those atoms, there are tiny electrons that are flying around at tremendous speed, etc., etc. It's an incredible meditation, but you'd only be in tune to it if you think about it. Otherwise, you won't spend time being inspired or impressed with this tremendous concept created by billions of atoms. You'll just see a simple glass. It will take a knowledge of this, what's powered, what gives a force, to be impressed by that force. In a similar way, it's the world. We all know, practically speaking, as we'll see shortly, we all do know that God is the force behind creation, and not just behind creation, but behind the constant existence and life force of every single thing. And if we just have the time to think about it, it will give us the awareness of God. In other words, this claim or this complaint or this concern that we can't see God is not really true. God can be seen every single day at every single moment if we just pay attention to it. So the Alter Rebbe in this chapter was helping us the meditation of not only that God can perceive and see things without eyes, just like you can see and feel everything in your body without seeing it with your five or being in tune to it with your five senses, but it's a much deeper oneness with all the experiences that your body experiences. You don't need your sense of touch to feel a pain in your foot. You don't need your ears, your eyes to sense a pain in your heart because it's party. The same thing, Hashem sees everything that's going on. And from our perspective, we don't have the, so to speak, the excuse or the concern that we can't see God. And therefore, how shall we sense God? Because if we don't see God, it's because we're not looking. God is very present and very there. It's just a matter of thinking about it. And that's what we're going to go with today. Today we're going to go into a very interesting discussion. And what is that? It's a phenomenal question. The Alter Rebbe, without asking the question, is addressing the question of faith. And he's asking, or he's addressing, what is faith? Faith by itself seems to be a very foolish concept. Why? If you know or believe something, so to speak, because of logic, logically it makes sense, then it's not faith. Faith means it doesn't make sense to me. Because, for an example, if I see on the table a glass cup, I don't have to have faith that the glass cup is here. I see it. If I see somebody do something incredible, I don't believe that it happened. I mean, if you told it to me, then I could believe it. And if I didn't see it. But if I saw something or it makes sense to me, that's not faith, that's logic. So faith must be something that I can't see or is not logical, doesn't make sense. So why would I believe it? Why would I believe something that doesn't make sense? So if it makes sense and it's logical, then it's not faith, it's logic. Logic tells me there must be, you walk into a store and you see a watch on the counter. It's not faith that somebody made that watch, it's logic. Logically, you see a watch on the table, you're not going to say, I bet it happened by itself, sitting all these years on the counter, slowly they evolved the watch. If you're an intelligent person, you're going to know some company or some factory made this watch. And the same thing with everything else. You're not a believer. I have faith, and I believe that this watch was manufactured in the factory. That's logic. So you can't call that faith. So if it's logic, why is it faith? And if it's irrational, if it's illogical, why is that a good idea to believe it? If something doesn't make sense, why would you believe it? So we're addressing what is faith? And the Alter Rebbe is going to give us something which is phenomenal to understand how faith works. And this subject might not be agreeable to every single Jew in the world or to every single person in the world. But this is the truth. It's one of those things that is true, but not everyone could admit this truth. And what is that? Every single Jew in the world, like it or not, accept it or not, believe it or not, believes in God. It's your identity. If you have a soul, if you're Jewish, if you have a neshama, you have faith. That's what neshamas do. It's like bees make honey, flames go upwards, gravity pulls things down. Jews believe. It's not a choice. If someone says, well, I'm an atheist, okay, so you say you're an atheist. Maybe in this situation today you think you're an atheist, but you can't be an atheist. You could cover up your faith, but it's only a fooling yourself, and it's really there. One of the fascinating things you find is that people who wrote letters to the Rebbe and claimed to be atheists, and they basically had questions or concerns or claims or thoughts that they shared with the Rebbe's response was always very fascinating, tremendously respectful of that person's opinions. At the same time, the wording was interesting. He would write, this that you're right, that you're an atheist. This that you say that you're an atheist. In other words, the Rebbe didn't say you're not saying there is not true. He's saying this that you say you're an atheist, and the Rebbe would address it, meaning it's only something you're saying, it's not your identity. In other words, every single Jew has a faith inside of them. It's like, for an example, when Picasso or Yitzhak Perlman was born, they had inside them an ability to either draw, Picasso, play the piano, play the violin, if you're Yitzhak Perlman, and so on and so forth, Michelangelo, to either paint or to sculpture. Meaning there are people that are born with certain skills and people who aren't born with skills. But being born with a skill is not enough. You have the skill, but you got to bring it out. It's like the power of speech we mentioned a long time ago, that every single human being is born with the power of speech. If a person grows up in an environment where they never have to speak, either because they're alone on an island or some other factor, they might not ever know they have this ability, but it's there. It has to be cultivated. So the fact that, you can take two people. One person is Yitzhak Perlman, who has the natural gift inside of him to play a violin. Another person, Yankel Goldberg, who would love to play the violin, but doesn't have it. They could both spend 20 years training. One will come out as the greatest violinist in the world. One will come out as a nice violin player who can sort of play violin, but there's no comparison. Why not? Because one person had a skill they were born with that they developed, cultivated, trained, and brought it out. And one person tried their best to develop a skill. So in other words, it's not enough to try, and it's not enough to have a skill. You have to have both. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us here. Your faith means really to hone a skill. It means really to develop and train yourself to tap into a part of yourself. It's almost like remembering. It's like reminding yourself constantly of something that you knew already. So the Alter Rebbe takes the word Emunah, of faith, that always is translated by everybody has faith, and he tells us a new translation. The word Uman means a skillful artist. There are many artists, many professionals that constantly train. You might tell yourself, you trained for years, why do you got to keep training? Because it's the constant training of a skill, fine-tuning the skill, that brings it to its perfection, brings it to its best point. And here's what the Alter Rebbe is going to say right here. We're on page Samach Aleph. I'm going to go back just a few lines to the third of the narrow lines on page Samach Aleph. It will be page 121 if you're the English pages. And he said as follows. Even though God is concealed by many layers, like a king who might be concealed by many layers, and you can't see the skin, the flesh, the hair of the king. But there are many people, by the way, who never saw the Tsar in their life and would tremble at the knowledge of the Tsar was coming to their town, or if they were called to speak to the Tsar for a meeting. Today, if you were called to the president's office, or if you like the president or not, that's another story. But if you were called to the president's office, you would be excited. You would tell your friends, get pictures. I'm going to meet the president. In the olden days, when there was a king, if you were called to meet the king, you would say your final prayers. You would pray to God. You would write a note to pray at the grave of a tzaddik and say, I hope I come out alive. The awe. And you never met the king before. It didn't matter. You knew what that meant because you knew the authority, the power had nothing to do with his skin and bones. And it could be, even when you met the king, he was standing, wrapped up in his coat of armor. It doesn't matter. The power of standing before the king affected you. The fact that God is covered to this world, and the Alter Rebbe uses the word in layers and layers. It's not just that in this physical world God's concealed. Go up to the spiritual world God's concealed. The angels are a small little drop, a insignificant nothing compared to the grand truth of God. And so in the higher worlds. So the layers of concealment, by the time you get to this physical world, all you can see is, physical material things. You can't even see, so to speak, dumbed down spirituality. We just see material stuff. God is concealed, yet we know that it's all God, like the metaphor we said last week with the Tzemach Tzedek, that he showed this 10-year-old boy, his hand moving back and forth, with covered by a handkerchief. The boy understood that it was a handkerchief being moved by a hand. He didn't say, well, I can't see the hand, so it must be the handkerchief moves by itself. He knew there must be a hand there, because why is the handkerchief going back and forth on the end of the arm of the Tzemach Tzedek? The same thing when we see our hand physically moving, we know it's not a flesh and blood moving, it's a soul. It's our life force that's keeping the body alive, that's allowing the fingers to move. It's just that we see it as flesh and blood, but it's really an identity called Moshe or someone else that's in the presence of a physical body, but it's really the identity, the soul, the true identity of Moshe. And the same thing is when we see the world. When we see the the budding of a flower, or the birth of a child, or the sun rising, or the miracle of the oxygen in our bodies, the way we function, we're not to be fooled and say, oh, so there's this physical thing that has its power. We recognize it's a life force of God that is giving it life, giving it ability to function, to be alive, to move, to develop. The brilliance of every aspect of creation is incredibly, unimaginably great if we just think about it. And this is what we're talking about here, that the way to see God requires training. Faith means to train yourself over and over and over how to see things. No different than it, I don't know if it's no different, but very similar to a child who is used to getting allowance from his parents every single day. And his parents every single day put a $20 bill in an envelope on the table. If he gets used to it, he walks into the room, grabs the envelope every single day. He doesn't think where it comes from or what. Now, I don't just mean that it comes from his parents, but it comes from a place in his parent that cares and loves. You have parents that pay their children's education in college or school, parents that pay their children's rent or mortgage and other things, send them a stipend to help them out in life. If the child doesn't take the time to think every day how caring and loving my parent is, to take the time every day to send this check in, to bring me this money every day, the child's not that he's ignorant, he doesn't know, he just doesn't think about it. He convinces himself, and he can come to a point, our parents don't really care for me. They don't even like me so much because he's being a fool. He's not seeing the truth. In that dollar bill is love. In that visit, in that phone call, in that baked, fresh baked, your favorite meal is love. So we see in things the love of our parents. We see in the world the reality of God. But it takes thinking. It takes meditating. It takes contemplation. It takes reminding ourselves and thinking, like I mentioned before, about every physical thing has atoms inside of it. You can go your entire life without knowing it or thinking about it because you never saw an atom. I never saw an atom. I saw a picture of an atom in a book. I never saw an atom in real life, not even under a microscope. So to know that it exists and that everything is made up of atoms takes a constant reminder. Now, on a regular day-to-day basis, it's not really that important to know. It doesn't really make a difference if you know that the glass cup in front of you is made up of billions of atoms, because the bottom line is you know how to use a glass cup to take a drink of water. But if there was a factor important, like all those life forces are godly life forces, and that will make you aware that everything you have is part of God, that might be something worth thinking about. But thinking about it means repeatedly, over and over, taking the time to consider this truth, to think about it, etc. And this is what he says. There is no difference at all, and we said this last week, I'm just getting back into the flow. When you see a king of flesh and blood, let's say the Tsar, whether he is not wearing any clothes at all, whether he's wearing one garment, or he's wearing many garments. So therefore, all that requires, and the Alter Rebbe uses this word tamid 3 times. He says, tamid means constantly, like ner tamid, the eternal flame, constantly. You have to constantly reflect upon this truth that everything you see in this world is merely a garment of God. No different than a hand covered by a cloth moving back and forth. It's really the hand moving it. No difference, a life force behind something, the electricity. It's really the electricity, it's really the Wi-Fi. It's really the part that you can't see that's giving this ability to function. The same thing while Hashem is concealed in layers and layers and layers, he is actually right here, so present, so here, so visible. And this is what we're saying, the tremendous truth that God is not invisible. God is not unseen. It's a matter of we know what we're looking at. We are looking at billions of atoms in the form of a cup. We're looking at the force of godliness in the form of a cup. We're looking at godliness in the blade of grass growing, and the sun shining, and the wind, and the temperature of our body being maintained at a safe 98.6 versus going too high or too low, and the way our body digests food. All of this can be seen as some fantastic, novelty of an isolated incident, or a tremendous unity of godliness that pervades every area of the universe, every area of creation, in a perfection, in a perfect synchronized life of function. that will give us a tremendous wow and appreciation of that we're standing in the center of God's universe. So in other words, while God doesn't have eyes, he still senses us. And while we can't see God, we could see God every single day if we just think about it. And that's the main message of chapter 42. You want to have fear of God, awe of God, the sense of godliness. You have to think about this truth. Think about it what do Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai want? That we should fear God like we fear another person. So many times a person could be talking to their wife in a way which is not the most, or their spouse in a way which is not the most appropriate way. They'd be ashamed to have this conversation, meaning this inappropriate conversation of being impolite or whatever it is in front of someone else. But you don't think for a moment that God's watching. If someone else was in the room, even a stranger, you would stop right now. And the proof is when the phone rings. Hello? What happened to your whole bad mood? All grouchy. Oh, because someone else is involved here. Or suddenly you see somebody walking by, close by, or someone knock on the door, your whole mood changes, or could change. Why? Because now someone else is there. There's a very interesting halacha, Jewish law, that says there are two types of thieves. There's one thief called a ganev, and one thief called a gazlan. A ganev is a thief who steals when no one's looking. He's the kid in school that goes into someone's backpack during break or recess and takes their money, or someone sneaks into someone's house and steals their jewelry when no one's around. That's a ganev. Then you have a gazlan. A gazlan is a brazen thief who grabs you by your shirt and says, give me your wallet. Or comes into your house with a bat and says, I'm taking your jewelry. So which one is worse? It says, it's brought down in the Talmud, that the one who is a thief in the secret is worse. And not just that he's worse, he has to because the thief who steals in the darkness and in hiding, he says, I'm not scared of God, but I'm scared of people. Because if people are looking, I won't steal. But God, I'm not scared of him. That means you make people more of a factor in your behavior than God. I'm afraid of people. If someone's watching, I wouldn't steal. But God's watching doesn't bother me. At least the guy who steals in public, he says, I treat you both the same. I'm not scared of God, I'm not scared of people. In other words, he doesn't make God worse than the people. And that's a concept brought down in Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai said, I want you to fear God like you fear people. What does that mean? The same way you would change your conduct if somebody was here. That's exactly how you should conduct yourself because God's watching. How should you make yourself aware God's watching? Think about the presence of God, not for a minute. Spend an hour every morning thinking about creation, about life, about the force of life, of how your body functions, how God's presence is everywhere, how you see God in incredible ways. And then you will start becoming, after a while, in tune to the presence of God. And you will not do certain things because you realize God is really here. I see him. I see God in tremendous ways. I see him in the way I turned before my car. I didn't get into this accident. I see him how he took care of this. You start seeing God in tremendous guidance. Hashgacha Pratis means God's individual guidance of every step, every moment of your life. And that's called Emunah. This comes from faith, not in trying to convince yourself that there's a God. That's not faith. Faith means thinking about, developing, honing, sharpening the skill. Just like the person playing the piano. In the beginning, it's so hard. I don't relate to it. I play the keys. You got to hit the keys over and over. There's a certain word for what they use in the beginning when you do the early stages of piano that the kids hate it. It's the torture to go over and over this exercise because you're not yet developed the skill. But let this child or this young adult go and develop the skill and work for months and months and months. It will be music, literally, because you pass the stage of waking it up. Now it flows, and you could play songs, and you could do enlighten hearts. And it might be the most relaxing thing and the most therapeutic thing for you to do is sit by the piano and play, because your soul gets to express itself. This is the way it works with faith. In the beginning, we're sort of troubled. I can't relate to it. I can't understand it. It sounds good when you say it, but I try it doesn't work. Try it again. Try it again. It's like learning a language. It's like any skill. It takes time to develop it. But once a person develops it and develops it and develops it, it becomes a natural skill that requires constant attention. Great musicians have to practice constantly. There was a famous musician, an older man, who I forget who it was, he played a cello, who when he was in his 80s or his 90s, someone asked him why he practices every day for a few hours a day. He's a musician for life. He says, if I miss one day, he says, I notice a difference in my music. If I miss 2 days, my band notices the difference. If I miss 3 days, the audience will notice it. In other words, as good as your skill is, you have to constantly train. It's true in every field, in every area of expertise. You're constantly going and training. And that's why a person will take a doctor who was a doctor for 30 years much quicker than took a doctor who's fresh out of medical school. You might think this guy's fresh out of medical school. He's the guy I want because he has everything fresh, all the information in his head. He knows everything. He learned the latest information. He's never honed his skills. That's wonderful that he knows everything, but then you got to train and work and work. They want a pilot only has 1,000 hours of flying to fly a commercial jet or whatever, how many hours. Why? The guy knows how to fly. You can't know and hone that skill until you've developed it for hours and hours and weeks and months and years. And that is the idea of Emunah. Emunah means amun, a skill. Faith is developed by over and over and over rethinking to yourself, not trying to be convinced of something. Think that which you know, that which you have inside of you, to come out. Let it flow. And through doing this, Yizkar tamid al panim yusam v'chayusam, you'll remember on the truth of the universe, the truth of everything, that it comes from Hashem. V'zanichlal gam kein b'loshen emunah. And this is what it means when you say the word faith. Emunah shu legilus shemargil ha'adam es atzmai. It means a routine, a training, an exercise. And this is a phenomenal thing the Alter Rebbe introduces. I don't know if it's written anywhere else, this concept that true faith is not something that you believe without logic. That's not faith. That's are you sure it's a good idea? Someone tells you something that doesn't make any sense. Should you believe them? It doesn't seem to make sense, because if it's logical, you don't need them to tell it to you. And if it's not logical, why would you believe something that doesn't make any sense? You know, there's an invisible man next to me. His name is Marty. Here, come look at him. I can't see him. Trust me, he's here. It doesn't make sense. Why would I believe it? Unless it's something I really know to be true, and I just have to be encouraged to let my feelings of my true feelings and knowledge come out. And that's Emunah. Like a skillful artist that constantly hones his skill, and the more he works with his hands, the more it becomes natural and authentic and skillful. And you can't compare a painter who has been painting for years. They say the earlier stages of painting, they paint like circles and lines and squares, and they develop that into a picture. A real painter doesn't paint anything. He's just expressing a feeling. He expresses himself with a brush. He doesn't even know what he's painting as far as which line he's making. It's a part of himself that's being expressed in his paintbrush. Now the Alter Rebbe is going to say one more thing. And this is where it comes into the idea that no such thing as an atheist. This is a fascinating idea he's going to say here. V'gam. He's going to finish the last 4 lines of this chapter with the word v'gam and also. What's and also mean? The Alter Rebbe recognizes that, by the way, the Rebbe is the one who gives a footnote on this here and explains what the Alter Rebbe is going to say here. The Rebbe explains as follows. The whole entire chapter here, until this point, that's the last, we did 6 classes on this, it's like 6, 7 pages more, is all explaining a meditation. You have to meditate on something to get to a certain place. Think about, if a person thinks about, one of the ideas you once spoke about is the bliss of ignorance. What's the bliss of ignorance? Let's say it says this is why God gave us the mitzvahs. We use it as a metaphor why God gave the mitzvahs not to angels but to human beings. It says, imagine if there was a diamond that was discovered at some point, that the diamond was worth like $4 billion. Billions of dollars is diamond, and it needed to be cut to, let's say, 12 separate diamonds. And the way it cut, it would either be, it would take a diamond and enhance its value, because now this diamond was cut and polished into its full possibility, or it could destroy the diamond. And any skillful diamond cutter could do this cut, because it wasn't a complicated cut to do. The problem was what was riding on this was so much. So they went to a guy who had no idea the value of this diamond, and they asked him to cut it, because they realized that the guy who understands the value of the diamond, his thought process would make him sweat and shake and be so nervous. It's like, when there's 30 seconds left to a big football game and there's one kick that's required to make the nerves, the feelings, all the emotion involved might throw you off. Someone who truly understands what's going on will shake and their hands would sweat when they're cutting this diamond. So they give it to a diamond cutter who's also skillful but doesn't know the value, and he can cut it no problem. He has no feelings involved here of someone else. That's why it says God gave the mitzvahs to human beings. An angel could never go and do the mitzvahs. If we would know what every time we lit a Shabbos candle would be, our hands would sweat and shake when we lit the Shabbos candles. If we knew the power of what was being accomplished in heaven. In other words, when you know something, it affects you emotionally, psychologically, biologically, fully, spiritually. It affects you. That's the purpose of chapter 42. Know, think, feel, recognize, understand who we are, that God cares about you personally, and he's paying attention, and what you're doing matters, and he's here. So this is the whole chapter 42. Says the Alter Rebbe, what's if you have a guy that doesn't feel? He's talking to us. He's not talking to spiritual giants. And sometimes we could read this entire chapter and say, okay, but I don't feel it. I hear, but it doesn't talk to me. See, when it comes to meditations, we have a few limitations. One is the effect could only be as deep as intellectual as we are. The more intellectual you are, the deeper you can connect to the idea and meditate. Someone who's not as deep and intellectual can't go as deep. So we're limited by that. We're limited by our character. Some of us, our personalities are that we're affected by information. Some people hear about someone that passed away in Israel and God forbid some terrible accident or a tragedy or a terrorist attack, and they feel bad. Wow, that's terrible. Some people will sit down and cry. Some people won't be able to function that day hearing the news. What's the difference? How you emotionally are affected by events that happen to people that you care about or in the world in general. The same thing is some people will read about an idea spiritually and become extremely spiritual and motivated and want to like sit and say the Shema or sing or meditate. Some people, oh, that's pretty interesting and fascinating. And even people that are inspired usually have days off. Some days I'm just not in the mood. We all wake up some days, I'm not in the mood today. I'm not in the mood of going to work. I'm not in the mood of doing my project. I'm not in the mood of exercising. I'm not in the mood of my diet. What happened to you? Yesterday you were so excited. Today I'm not. We're rubber bands. We have days off and days on. That's how we are. We're human. On days and off days. So because of all these factors, not every person, not every time, and not every situation is going to be inspired by chapter 42, by the meditation. Says the Alter Rebbe, there's one more option you have. If you're not inspired by the last 6-7 pages, to the meditation to be suddenly so moved, there's one more step that in a way is even better. Don't think about it. Don't try and figure it out. Don't try and understand. Just do what God said because he said so. That alone is enough. Let's see this inside what he says here. And the point is, it's called, and this is really appropriate to coming into Rosh Hashanah, because there's a mitzvah that says we have to make God as our king. That's the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah. God becomes the king. And this couple lines here talk about this mitzvah in a very practical way that anyone could do. You don't have to be a deep thinker. You don't have to meditate. You don't have to be intellectually advanced. Anybody, you don't have to be super spiritual or super sensitive. Just follow instructions. There's a word in Hebrew that's called oil. Oil is the word for a yoke that you put on a cow. A cow that's going to plow a field, they put on this wooden or leather wooden thing on its shoulder that attaches it to a plow. That's called a yoke. They have a similar thing for horses that they use to put the reins attached to it. That means even though you don't want to do it, this is what you're going to be doing. I know you don't want to. You'd rather sit and eat hay. You'd rather walk around and be lazy. But today you're going to plow the field. Today you're going to pull the wagon. And that is called a yoke. We have that in Hebrew. It's called Kabbalas El Malchus Shamayim, accepting upon ourselves the yoke of heaven. I know you don't feel it. I know you don't want it. I know you're not interested, but you do it anyway. And while it seems to be a very low level of service, it's really one of the highest levels of service. Why? Because our intellect could only reach as far as our intellect could reach. What we're doing, because God said so, we're riding on God's power. Meaning we're not using our strength anymore, we switch to hydraulics. When you're trying to lift up a heavy item, you can only lift up as much as your muscles allow you to lift up. But if you're using hydraulics, it's no longer about you. I myself have no abilities. I'm a weakling. But I know where the button is on the tractor, and I can push it and lift up 2,000 tons. Why? Because it's not my strength anymore. So while the entire chapter is telling you use your own strength, use your own meditation, use your intellect, and try and feel, discover, and experience a relationship with Hashem, at the end of the day, you know what the highest level is? Or what you could do if you're stuck, which is also still the highest level. Just accept it. It's a truth. You were born with it. It's part of your identity. You're Jewish. Accept this reality upon yourself. There's a God, and accept him upon yourself. I don't understand, doesn't make sense, I don't know why. Good. And now accept it anyway. That is an ultimate, very high level of Kabbalah Sale, which means I don't understand. I don't feel. I don't know. But this is what I do. Why? Because that's what God says. And this is the ultimate, he says, or the final plug of chapter 42. The Gam, and furthermore, he's talking to the average Jew who doesn't suddenly read chapter 42 and suddenly walk away feeling like a spiritual person that sees God in every experience, because they haven't yet got past learning the basic keys of the piano. Leah says, remember what the sages tell us, Kabbalah's el malchus shemayim, accepting the yoke of heaven. It's not a matter of I understand or don't understand. It's a matter of accepting the truth and accepting reality because God said so. Like we say, and it's coming up in Rosh Hashanah, this mitzvah, there's a mitzvah to make God your king. What does that mean? God doesn't want him to force you to be his king. He wants you to put him as your king over him. In other words, there's two ways that God, well, there's more than two ways. There's three ways that we're talking about, but one is a meditative process that I get there through thinking. One is that God holds the mountain over our heads and we accept. Another one is you say, God, I don't understand. I don't know. I don't know where this comes from, but I'm a Jew and I believe and I accept. This is, in a way, the deepest part of the relationship. It's like a child who looks at their mother and feels that the mother is the meanest mom in the world because she didn't let me go to that party with my friends. She doesn't let me wear the dress I want to wear. She won't give me the money when I ask her. She won't give me the keys to the car. She won't let me go to the school I want to go there. She won't let me this. And she says, you know what, Mom? I don't understand. I don't agree. I don't like what you're doing, but you're my mom and I accept you. I know you love me. I don't understand. That, in a way, is a much deeper relationship than loving your mom because you understand everything she does and why she does and how she does it. Why? Because I'm not working on my understanding of our relationship. I know one thing. You gave birth to me. You're my mom. I know you love me. I don't understand why you do things to me. I don't understand why. I'll talk about a mom who could be sometimes a little bit abusive, not getting there. I'm talking about a healthy mother. This is the ultimate relationship. I don't agree with what you're doing. I don't know why you're doing it. I don't like the way you do it. I can't see you, Mom. I don't see our relationship. But I know you're my mother, and I love you, Mom. And I don't agree. I don't understand, but I love you. This is what God said. At the end of the day, biologically, a Jew has faith. An atheist doesn't exist by a Jew. We could cover it up like a child can cover up their love. A child could cover up their love and think they hate their mom. Unfortunately, God forbid, the mom's in an accident. Suddenly that love could come out, and sometimes it won't because the love is so badly covered and so concealed. But in general, 99 out of 100 times, the teenager that hates their mom, if something happens to their mom, they'll be heartbroken. Why? I thought you hate your mom. Well, on a certain level I did, but I love her. She's my mom. We can hate God. We can say, I don't believe in you, God. We can say all these things. But that's because we're human beings and we cover our feelings up and we justify all our behaviors however we want. But like it or not, and I said this is a statement I start off today saying that many a Jew will have an issue with the statement, because I remember once saying this as a class with teenagers at we had a teenage conference in Chicago, and I was giving a talk that touched on the subject. And one of the teenagers there said, listen, I'm an atheist, and I don't think you have the right to tell me that I'm not an atheist. I said, you're right. I don't have that right, and I'm not saying it. I'm quoting what it says in the Torah, and you could accept it or not. But you're right. I have no right to tell you what you believe. It's none of my business. I can't judge you. I can't tell you what you believe. But I'm just telling you that a soul, by definition, this is what it is. And it's not an argument you can have, because first of all, no one has a right to oppose anybody else. Tell them, really, you like chicken? Really, you know that the let's say a person lives in Canada to be safe. You really know the prime minister is doing the right thing. You just won't admit it. No, I don't have a right to tell someone what they believe. But the Torah is telling us something. The definition, what's the definition of a Jew? It doesn't mean I paid a service membership to a club. It means I have an neshama. And definition of a neshama is a part of God. By definition, a neshama feels. When I say you believe, it doesn't mean that all your feelings, you might have a subconscious part of you that wants to do a sin. Yes, you truly want to do a sin right now, but that's only the shallow part of yourself. As you mentioned many times, the deeper part of your identity doesn't want you to break your diet, doesn't want you to do that thing, doesn't want you to get drunk tonight. But you're feeling weak. You're right now in the moment. I don't want to think all the thoughts that will hold me back from my passion. but deep down, you can't deny the truth. And this is what he's saying here. As much as we can't tap into our intellectual and therefore the proper meditation process, okay, but know one thing. Deep down, this is your identity and accept it. Soim tasim alecha melech, accept God as your king. It's a very powerful statement, and as I mentioned, it's something which I could see somebody having an argument about this, and that's fine. We're allowed to argue about issues of faith, but this is the perspective of Torah, how the Alter Rebbe presents it. And what should you finally think about as he closes his chapter, the last two lines? Ki Kadosh Baruch Hu, why should you feel this way about God? Because the truth is, that's how God feels about you. It's like a child whose mother loves her, and that's why God puts aside all the higher spiritual worlds and all the higher angels, the seraphim and the chayis and the tzilus, and he puts aside the lower worlds. Like we said at the beginning of chapter 41, and he focuses upon you individually and personally. God cares right now what you're going to do. He's right now, nothing else in the world matters to him except you. At the same time, he's looking at every person the same way. But no one else matters right now to God except you, and he wants to see, are you going to choose A, to say the words of benching, or B, not to? Are you going to say the words to hurt someone else or not? Etc., etc. And what choice you make will affect God completely. And we accept this relationship. This is why we bow down in the Amidah. What does it mean when we daven the Amidah during the blessings we say every single Shemona Esrei, and we bend our head, Baruch Atah Hashem? Why are we bowing down? We're bowing down to Hashem, recognizing this relationship. This is the idea of bowing down by the Amidah. After we went now, you see the Shema has the first two paragraphs. The first one accepts God as King. Shema Yisrael, Hashem is our God, Hashem is our King, Hashem is one. And that's the first chapter. Second chapter is accepting the mitzvahs. And now we come to the Amidah, we bow down to further emphasize and accept this relationship. To go and physically, that's what you said verbally, God, I accept you as our King. Now I do a physical action. I bend my head and my back and my spine, and I say, God, I bend before you. You are my King. You are my God. This is the most beautiful way to finish a class before Rosh Hashanah, because the whole thing of Rosh Hashanah, sound of the shofar, is crowning God as our King above us. Tamlacheni Alechem, we're crowning God as our King. I just want to finish off today with a little insight in the beginning of this week's portion. We're not going to read it this Shabbos and Shul because it's Rosh Hashanah. We'll read it the following Shabbos. But this Shabbos, this week, the portion that we're reading is the portion of Ha'azinu. It's the second to last portion of the Torah. And we're reading the portion how it starts off, Ha'azinu Hashemayim v'sishma aretz. It says, listen the heavens and listen the earth. But the word for listen by heavens and listen by earth is different words. By heavens, it says Ha'azinu, which comes from the word ozim, which means ear. It's like I'm talking into your ear. I'm talking very close. V'sishma, listen, is from a distance. I'm listening from far. I'm listening to God from from far. So why the one time does it say you listen from close and one listen from far? So by heavens it says close, and by Shemayim, by earth it says far. Because it's talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was very spiritually high, and for him, talking to spirituality, talking to matters of God, were very close. So he uses the words Hazinu. Listen to words that are close. Words of haaretz, material, physical, corporal, for Moshe that's far away. So he says an expression of a distance. And this is the idea that the Alter Rebbe is really addressing us, that Moshe Rabbeinu, for him to access these points, is very easy. For Moshe to tap into spirituality, for Moshe to feel the yira, the awe, the fear of God, it's a hazinu, it's really close. Without that, it's very far. And that's why for us to really feel godliness close, we have to tap into the Moshe Rabbeinu, which is inside of us. And chapter 42 told us this point. There's a Moshe Rabbeinu inside of us. We have to tap into that Moshe Rabbeinu. We have to tap into that true identity, and then suddenly we'll see it's not that far. It seems far. These ideas seem very distant. But once we can uncover, and we mentioned removing the dirt, and lifting up and awakening the Moshe within us, we give the metaphors, and thinking about God's watching and seeing everything, and how we really see God. And this faith is a part of us. These are the ideas of chapter 42 that we take with us now into chapter 43 to discover now a much greater level of fear. Until now, we spoke about a lower level of fear. Chapter 43, we're going to talk about a higher level of fear. We'll stop here unless there's a question. Okay, we want to wish everybody a beautiful, healthy Rosh Hashanah, a meaningful new year to be inscribed in the book of life, and especially healthy, and especially healthy, and especially healthy.
Amen.